Hello, my friends. As the year draws to a close, the central crisis shaping Europe's political, financial, and strategic future remains the war in Ukraine. Over the past week, one development stands out above all others. The European Union's decision to abandon its earlier plan of leveraging frozen Russian assets and instead extend a massive €90 billion loan to Ukraine, backed indirectly by the EU budget and placed on international financial markets. This decision marks a qualitative shift in Europe's role in the conflict, one that binds the continent not merely politically or morally, but financially and structurally to the continuation of the war. The logic of a loan is simple and unforgiving. Those who lend money expect to be repaid. In this case, repayment is not tied to Ukrainian economic recovery, stabilization, or reconstruction. It is tied to a single contingency: Russian defeat and the payment of reparations. Without that outcome, the loan cannot realistically be repaid by Ukraine itself. This transforms the loan into what can only be described as a war loan, one that creates a direct financial interest in the continuation and escalation of hostilities. This is not a marginal technical detail. It represents the institutionalization of war logic within the European Union. From this point forward, the continuation of the conflict is no longer merely a matter of political alignment with Washington or moral posturing against Moscow. It is a matter of protecting Europe's financial credibility and shielding its leaders from domestic political reckoning. The structure of this loan is especially revealing. European governments are not directly lending taxpayer money to Ukraine through national parliamentary approval. Instead, the funds will be raised through bond issuance on international markets. Investors who purchase these bonds will expect repayment. Yet repayment is only feasible if Russia is defeated and compelled to pay reparations. This means that international investors themselves now acquire a vested interest in the war's outcome. However, there is a fundamental contradiction embedded in this structure. A growing number of investors, analysts, and financial institutions no longer believe that Russia will be defeated militarily. As a result, demand for these bonds is likely to be weak, or else conditioned on high interest rates and additional guarantees from EU member states. Those guarantees, whether explicit or implicit, will ultimately fall on European taxpayers. European leaders have floated the idea that should Russia never pay reparations, frozen Russian assets held in Euroclear might be seized outright. Yet this proposal faces the same legal and political obstacles that derailed earlier plans. A critical mass of EU states opposes outright seizure, and the legal ramifications would be enormous. At some point, if reparations do not materialize, investors will demand repayment directly from the EU. Europe cannot afford to default. A default would shatter the Union's financial credibility and destabilize its internal economic architecture. This reality places European leaders in a strategic trap. Previously, they retained an escape route. They could verbally support Ukraine, obstruct peace initiatives, and, if Ukraine ultimately lost, shift blame onto external actors, particularly the United States. That option no longer exists. Europe is now financially liable for a war whose outcome it does not control. Contrary to some fears, this financial entanglement does not necessarily push Europe toward direct, kinetic war with Russia. While a handful of states in northeastern Europe might contemplate such catastrophic escalation, there is no evidence of broad political will for direct confrontation. Instead, the loan ensures something else: fierce European resistance to any negotiated settlement that would relieve Russia of reparations obligations. Any peace agreement brokered by Washington, including those associated with Donald Trump or his advisors, would immediately crystallize the loan and trigger demands for repayment from investors. This creates a powerful incentive for European leaders to obstruct diplomacy. From this moment onward, prolonging the war becomes a financial necessity for Europe's political class. The decision made last week ensures that European leaders now have a direct material interest in preventing peace. This financial entrapment unfolds against a grim military backdrop for Ukraine. Over the past 24 hours, Russia has launched another massive combined missile and drone strike across Ukrainian territory. Air-launched cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, hypersonic Kinzhal systems, and large numbers of unmanned aerial vehicles were employed. According to Russia's defense ministry, the strikes targeted Ukrainian defense industrial enterprises and energy infrastructure, achieving all assigned objectives. Notably, hypersonic missiles that were once used sparingly are now a routine component of Russian strike packages. This reflects not only production capacity, but strategic confidence. Energy infrastructure, fuel depots, and logistical arteries, particularly in and around Odessa, have been systematically targeted. Blackouts persist, and with winter temperatures dropping and snow now falling, the humanitarian consequences are likely to be severe. On the ground, the situation continues to deteriorate for Ukrainian forces. In the Zaporozhye region, Russian troops are steadily expanding control within Gulyai Pol, now holding a majority of the town. Further north, Russian units are pushing across and beyond the Oskol River, capturing villages and widening bridgeheads. Once these positions stabilize, vast stretches of open steppe lie ahead, largely devoid of defensive fortifications. This opens pathways towards Zaporozhye city itself and threatens encirclement of Ukrainian positions such as Orakov. In the Pokrovsk sector, reports indicate that Ukrainian resistance in Mirnograd has collapsed or is nearing collapse. Ukrainian counterattacks toward northwestern Pokrovsk have resulted in extensive vehicle losses, with video evidence showing dozens of destroyed armored units along key highways. Russian control over the broader Pokrovsk area appears intact. Around Konstantinovka, Russian forces are tightening their grip from multiple directions. While claims of controlling over half the town lack independent confirmation, there is clear evidence of encirclement pressure building from the south and west. A sudden Ukrainian collapse in this sector would not be surprising. Further north, Russian advances continue in the Kharkov and Sumy regions, while pressure mounts in the Seversk-Slavyansk axis. Reports of Ukrainian activity in areas like Kupiansk have diminished, suggesting stabilization under Russian control despite contradictory statements from Ukrainian commanders. Despite these developments, some Western commentators persist in claiming that Russia is not advancing and that Ukrainian defeat can still be reversed with additional aid. This narrative increasingly strains credibility. Financial Times articles and political statements in Washington continue to insist that a few more weapons and funds could secure victory or at least a favorable settlement. Such arguments ignore the cumulative realities on the battlefield. Europe's financial gamble compounds the risk. If Ukraine's military position collapses while Europe remains on the hook for 90 billion euros, EU leaders will face a reckoning not only with voters, but with international markets. They cannot default. They will have to pay. Attempts by European leaders to reposition themselves diplomatically appear hollow. Calls for dialogue ring false when negotiations would require Russian agreement to reparations, an outcome Moscow has categorically rejected. Without that concession, talks cannot progress. As a result, diplomacy is effectively frozen, not by Russian intransigence, but by Europe's own financial self-binding. Meanwhile, Ukraine's internal situation grows more unstable. Funding flows may arrive slower than anticipated due to bond market realities. Ukraine's debts to the IMF, World Bank, and G7 remain unresolved. Even a full 90 billion euro infusion would be insufficient to cover future war costs beyond the near term. This environment incentivizes intensified internal corruption and political infighting as elites scramble to secure access to dwindling external funds. All of this points to a bleak conclusion. The war will be decided on the battlefield, not in conference rooms. European leaders, having tied their fortunes to an increasingly implausible Russian defeat, have foreclosed their own options. Ukraine faces worsening military, economic, and internal political pressures. Russia, by contrast, continues to prosecute the war methodically, expanding control and applying sustained strategic pressure. The decision to issue this loan may come to be seen as one of the most consequential and misguided acts of the war, an act that transformed a political commitment into a financial trap, locking Europe into a conflict whose outcome is slipping further beyond its control. What makes the European decision particularly dangerous is not merely its scale, but the precedent it establishes. For the first time in the history of the European Union, a collective financial instrument has been explicitly tied to the outcome of a war involving a non-member state. This breaks a long-standing, if often unspoken, principle of European integration, that the Union's fiscal architecture exists to stabilize peace, not to underwrite open-ended conflict. Once that boundary is crossed, it becomes exceedingly difficult to restore it. From this moment onward, European policy making toward Ukraine is no longer flexible. It is path-dependent. Every battlefield development, every diplomatic initiative, every shift in American policy will now be filtered through a single overriding question. Does this endanger repayment of the loan? If the answer is yes, resistance will follow. This applies not only to peace talks, but to any ceasefire, armistice, or frozen conflict scenario that falls short of Russian defeat. Europe has effectively wagered its financial credibility on an outcome it does not control. This creates a profound asymmetry between Europe and the United States. Washington can change course. It can reduce funding, push negotiations, or even disengage partially, absorbing political fallout domestically. Europe cannot. Once the bonds are issued and purchased, Europe is locked in. The market does not care about moral narratives or strategic messaging. It cares about repayment. This is why the European decision represents a far deeper commitment than any prior weapons package or budgetary transfer. There is also a deeper structural irony at play. European leaders have long insisted that Russia is economically fragile, diplomatically isolated, and strategically exhausted. Yet the loan implicitly assumes the opposite. It assumes a Russia capable of paying vast reparations, tens or hundreds of billions of euros, at the conclusion of the war. One cannot simultaneously argue that Russia is collapsing and that it will soon finance Europe's balance sheet. These positions are mutually exclusive. The loan reveals, inadvertently, that European planners understand that Russia is neither collapsing nor disappearing. On the Russian side, this development likely reinforces existing strategic assumptions. Moscow has long argued that the West is not interested in peace, but in prolonging the conflict to weaken Russia. The loan provides concrete evidence for that claim. It formalizes Western financial dependence on continued war. From Moscow's perspective, this reduces incentives to negotiate and increases incentives to press its military advantage until political realities in Europe force a reckoning. This brings us to the battlefield itself, where trends increasingly favor Russia's operational logic. Russian strikes are no longer episodic or symbolic. They are systematic, cumulative, and integrated across domains. The regular use of hypersonic systems signals not desperation but normalization. Energy infrastructure attacks are not designed to produce immediate collapse, but to erode resilience over time, particularly during winter months when repair capacity is limited and civilian pressure mounts. On the ground, Russian advances follow a familiar pattern: probing, fixing, encircling, and exhausting. Rather than dramatic breakthroughs, Russian forces steadily degrade Ukrainian defensive lines, forcing withdrawals, stretching reserves, and exploiting terrain that offers little natural defense. The emphasis on logistics, fuel depots, transport hubs, supply routes suggests a long war strategy aimed at systemic paralysis rather than headline-grabbing offensives. Western discourse often misreads this approach because it is conditioned to expect rapid, decisive maneuvers. When those do not occur, analysts conclude that Russia is stagnating. In reality, the war is unfolding according to a logic of attrition in which time, resources, and industrial capacity matter more than territory gained per week. On those metrics, Ukraine is increasingly disadvantaged. The internal consequences for Ukraine are likely to intensify as financial pressures mount. Even if the full 90 billion euros eventually reaches Kyiv, it will arrive incrementally under conditions of oversight and competition among domestic power centers. This environment fosters corruption, factional struggle, and institutional decay. Anti-corruption scandals should not be interpreted primarily as Western leverage or intelligence maneuvering, but as symptoms of a system under terminal stress, where elites scramble to secure dwindling external resources. At the same time, public messaging from Ukrainian leadership grows increasingly disconnected from battlefield realities. Repeated claims of imminent breakthroughs, critical shortages of air defense, or decisive Western interventions function less as strategic communication and more as signals of desperation. They reflect a leadership caught between external expectations and internal collapse, unable to reconcile narrative with reality. For Europe, the political consequences are only beginning to surface. As economic conditions tighten and voters confront higher taxes, inflationary pressures, and social spending cuts, the question of Ukraine will inevitably move from abstract solidarity to concrete accountability. Unlike previous crises, this one cannot be blamed entirely on external shocks. The financial commitment is explicit, traceable, and measurable. Voters will know where the money went and why it cannot be recovered. This is why the loan represents not merely a policy error, but a strategic self-entrapment. European leaders have converted a foreign policy stance into a domestic liability. They have tied their political survival to a military outcome that grows less plausible with each passing month. In doing so, they have narrowed their own room for maneuver to almost nothing. In the final analysis, the war's trajectory will not be determined by declarations, summits, or editorials. It will be determined by industrial output, manpower, logistics, and morale. On those fronts, Russia continues to demonstrate endurance and adaptability, while Ukraine faces compounding constraints. Europe, having bound itself financially to the continuation of the war, may soon discover that it has sacrificed strategic autonomy for an illusion of control. The tragedy is not merely that peace has been postponed, but that it has been priced out of reach. In the end, wars do not conclude because narratives collapse or because political leaders tire of repeating them. They end when material realities impose limits that rhetoric can no longer disguise. The war in Ukraine is now entering that phase. The European Union's financial commitment has not stabilized the situation, it has crystallized it. By transforming political alignment into financial obligation, Europe has bound itself to an outcome it cannot guarantee and cannot escape. This is the defining paradox of the current moment. Europe has wagered its credibility on a Russian defeat while simultaneously demonstrating, through its own actions, that it does not believe such a defeat can be achieved quickly, decisively, or at acceptable cost. The loan is not an expression of confidence. It is an admission of strategic exhaustion. It reflects a recognition that Ukraine cannot sustain the war on its own, that American commitment is uncertain, and that Europe has run out of instruments short of financial self-binding. For Russia, the implications are straightforward. Time is no longer merely an ally. It is a force multiplier. Every month that passes without a decisive reversal deepens Europe's exposure and narrows its options. Every incremental advance on the battlefield compounds political pressure in European capitals. Moscow does not need dramatic victories. It needs continuity, resilience, and patience. The current trajectory supplies all three. Ukraine, by contrast, finds itself trapped between incompatible imperatives. It must project strength to sustain external support while confronting internal decay driven by debt, corruption, manpower shortages, and infrastructure degradation. Even large infusions of money cannot resolve these contradictions. They merely postpone their collision. As resources shrink relative to need, internal struggles intensify, legitimacy erodes, and cohesion weakens. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural one. Europe's leaders now face the consequences of having replaced strategy with commitment. By tying financial survival to military success, they have converted diplomacy into a threat to their own balance sheets. Negotiations, ceasefires, and compromises tools once used to manage risk have become liabilities. The result is paralysis. Europe cannot escalate decisively, cannot disengage safely, and cannot negotiate honestly without triggering the very crisis it sought to avoid. History offers no shortage of examples where great powers entangled themselves in conflicts through financial instruments designed to defer accountability. Those episodes rarely end well. Markets do not forgive political miscalculations. Voters do not indefinitely subsidized strategic illusions. And wars fought to protect sunk costs rather than achievable objectives tend to consume far more than originally invested. The decisive factor, as it has always been, remains the battlefield. Not because war is glorious or inevitable, but because material power ultimately constrains political imagination. As long as Russian forces continue to advance methodically, degrade Ukrainian capacity, and absorb external pressure without systemic failure, the strategic equation will continue to tilt in Moscow's favor. No financial engineering can reverse that reality. What we are witnessing, therefore, is not simply the end of a year, but the closing of a phase. The period in which the war could be sustained through narrative dominance, incremental aid, and symbolic unity is drawing to a close. What follows will be harsher, more explicit, and less forgiving. Choices deferred will return as obligations. Assumptions ignored will reappear as costs. When the reckoning comes, and it will not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a slow recognition that the outcome was shaped long before it was acknowledged. The tragedy lies not only in the suffering endured, but in the realization that many of the constraints now treated as unavoidable were voluntarily constructed. At that point, the question will no longer be who supported whom or who said what at which summit. The question will be simpler and more brutal. Whether the war was prolonged because it could be won, or because it had become too expensive politically and financially to end. History, as always, will answer that question without mercy.